Recently, we've been discussing the role that architects play in society. And last time we talked about the perception of architects by the general public, potentially through the media or popular culture, and maybe misconceptions that people have about what it is that architects do. And throughout this unit, we'll be talking about what it is that architects actually do and things that they're responsible for and the role that they play in the creation of buildings, the design of buildings, and the role that they play throughout the phases of a building project. Now, this is a photo of some actual architects. This is a firm, Olson Kundig, in Seattle, and we'll look at realistically how you become an architect, even if you aren't on the path to becoming an architect or you don't have any interest in that, what role you can potentially play in participating in a building project or interacting with architecture firms or architects. And hopefully this gives you a little more insight into what the profession is all about. Sometimes we look at what architects aspire to and what they're inspired by. And Daniel Burnham was an architect in Chicago, and he was responsible for the World's Fair, which they refer to as the Columbian Exposition, at the end of the 19th century, so in 1893. And he has this famous quote that says, "Make no little plans, they have no magic to stir men's blood, and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans, aim high, and hope and work, remembering that a noble, logical diagram, once recorded, will not die." And so that serves as kind of an inspirational message to architects, because sometimes as we look at the role and responsibility of architects, and often the rules that are applied to the profession, it can seem that a potentially creative endeavor could be constricted somehow, especially by, the realities of construction or the realities of laws and legal ramifications on the profession. But I think architects are always trying to kind of take a step back and say, what's the big picture here? How can we make a little magic with what we've got or what this project is all about. And one of the, kind of time-honored scholars that we look to is someone named Vitruvius. And Vitruvius Polio was, I'm probably mispronouncing that last name, but was a Roman architect who wrote almost like a manifesto. It was called De Architectura, and in it he wrote about the ideals that an architect should have when designing a building. And a lot of times people will say, well, this building fulfills this characteristic, or this building does this, but it doesn't do everything that it could or should, or maybe this building didn't, maximize its potential as a project. And he kind of set out these three main ideals that every good design of a building should have. And the three, as they're written, are firmitas, utilitas, and venustas. And translated, that translates as firmness, commodity, and delight. And this has been analyzed for centuries, and a lot of architects really try and take this kind of design triad and pull them together and try and find that sweet spot between the three. So between firmness, commodity, and delight. So let's look at firmness. What does that mean? When we talk about firmness, it could be, the structure itself. Is the structure sound? But really, is this something that is going to be a stable building? Is it going to be safe? Is it going to be lasting? Is it going to be something that can be, relied upon as, having some kind of building integrity or structural integrity? And, when you look at these three things and you try and say, okay, well, you could have firmness but not the other two. Well, you certainly see buildings that fulfill firmness and maybe not the other two. They're not delightful or maybe even useful. But firmness certainly is, kind of literally and figuratively the backbone on which good buildings are built. So a good building needs to be sound and, not just firmness in the sense of its structural core only, but, is it solid? Is it solidly built? You can also have a building that is designed well, but maybe is not executed well in the construction. And you've probably seen examples of this where it was maybe a good idea, but for whatever reason, when it was built, it was just not done in either a quality way or in a way that was thoughtful, and so does not have a good kind of firm result at the end. So firmness is certainly a key component of a good building or a good design. Then we look at commodity, and this word is translated as commodity, utilitas, but we can kind of think of it as usefulness. And I show this picture of the stair and ramp combination because, it's one of these things where this is a plaza and it's on multiple levels, and without this connecting piece, many of the buildings would be unknown to each other, and people would not be able to span this plaza or this open courtyard without it. And sometimes there are just things that we need. Now, this is not even a building, this little kind of park or stair and ramp procession, but when we think of buildings, they've got to be useful in order for them to be serving the purpose that they should, serving the users, serving the client, serving the people who go in and out of them every day. And if a building is not useful, it's sometimes really hard to notice whether it's structurally sound or whether it's firm or whether it's delightful, because usefulness is something that is really apparent, especially to the people who use it even infrequently. But if you notice something or you use a building that is designed in a way that is certainly unhelpful to users, it's obvious. And a lot of times as an architect or even a non-architect, as you kind of start your thinking and seeing like an architect process, you can go through buildings and think, well, what if this had been different? Or what if the designers of this building had done this? Then it could have been more useful. And as you kind of practice that thinking, you start to become better at understanding what it is that's useful. Useful to one person may be different to another person. But certainly when we're talking about users of buildings, it needs to be at least useful to the people who use it all the time. Now, when we talk about delight, a lot of times that is a pretty subjective thing. Usefulness and firmness can be a bit more objective, but delight can be spectacular, it can be overwhelming, or it could be extremely subtle and nuanced. It doesn't have to be big either. You could have an extremely small, delightful, comfortable, harmonious space. And, sometimes when we talk about delight, that's defined probably by the user or by the person experiencing the building or viewing it. But delight is many different things. It could be, usefulness plus beauty, or harmony, or some kind of design element that surprises you in some unexpected but really positive way. And so delight can be all different kinds of things, but I think that's what architects strive for, is that element of delight that is potentially different on every project. And because there are different parameters on every project that you work on, it's that kind of intangible quality of delight that you're always trying to pursue. Now, when we're talking about the practice of architecture and designing buildings and carrying buildings throughout their kind of construction process, we talk a lot about this term standard of care. And so the standard of care for architects is really, what are the expectations of the architect? What are the expectations of themselves? What do they expect of themselves ethically? What do they expect of themselves kind of morally and legally? But the standard of care should be at a high standard. So there's a professional standard of care, there's a legal standard of care. When we talk about the professional standard of care, we talk about kind of an accepted level of responsibility that architects have and share on building projects. And that could be defined specifically in a contract. That could be defined by the professional organizations that regulate architecture. It could be defined by peers, like other architects, or even engineers or other people that might happen to be part of a project team that an architect works on. But this standard of care is something that runs through all projects, and it could be a really small project or it could be a very large project, but the architect is always expected to hold to a certain standard of care, and that idea of care, you could even replace the word concern, like a standard of concern or a level of concern on the project. So all of these things that the architect's responsible for, you're expected to have a level of concern for a variety of things and kind of the same level of concern. Basically, not saying, okay, well, I care about kind of the delight aspect of buildings, but I don't really care about whether it stands up or whether it's useful. You can kind of always go back to those Vitruvian ideals and say, okay, the standard of care for all architects on all of these issues should be the same. It should be a really high level of concern. The architect's duties, it kind of is derived from that standard of care. So, what is the architect truly responsible for? And, sometimes when we talk about the architect's duties, I think most people might say, well, I think that they're responsible for designing a building. Well, yes, that's true, but they're also responsible to serve the client's needs. They might be contractually obligated to the client. They might be contractually obligated to the people who work on their project team, such as their engineers and other consultants. So not only are the architect's duties including just the design and documentation of the project that they're working on, but their duties can include things like, paying your subconsultants on time, meeting with the client, working closely with the contractor, showing up to job site meetings and recording what they see and providing field reports and documentation. So the architect's duties can kind of expand or contract depending on what the project is. But as you go through different projects, you might have a greater level of responsibility on one project. You might have less if you're just a consultant on another project. So the architect's duties can really range and vary widely depending on what the project is and also what has been defined as the architect's kind of prescribed activities on a certain project. Part of what we look to is when we're talking about the architect's duties and the level of care or the standard of care is the American Institute of Architects. And the American Institute of Architects is the professional organization that represents architects in the United States. And, its initials are AIA. So if you see someone's name with AIA after their name, that means they're a member of the American Institute of Architects, but AIA also indicates that they're a licensed architect or registered architect in a state in the United States. Because you can't use those initials unless you are registered. If you're non-registered, you can become a member of the AIA, but you are an associate AIA member. So you sometimes see that after people's names, it'll say like associate, probably abbreviated, and then AIA. But the American Institute of Architects does a lot of different things when we're talking about the architect's role on a project. Or kind of the architect's role in public concern and in society. They publish a lot of documentation and forms and contracts that architects use a lot with clients and with their consultants and engineers. So there's been a lot of production and rewriting and going over all of these forms that are kind of go-to documents for architects. And as we discussed in the last lecture, there aren't probably as many architects in the United States as maybe most people would think. So this is, not a huge percentage of the American population, but certainly it's important in terms of representing architects as a profession. Now, the AIA is just the professional organization that represents architects, but you do not have to be a member of the AIA in order to be licensed. You can be a registered architect, you can be a licensed architect, and choose not to become a member of the American Institute of Architects. But if you want to practice architecture, and we'll discuss this more in the next few lectures, but if you want to practice architecture, you need to be registered in a state or American jurisdiction or U.S. territory, and you need to choose one of those states in order to become licensed in that state. Now, in Texas, it's the Texas Board of Architectural Examiners, or TBAE, that regulates the licensure and registration of architects. And as you complete all the requirements for registration and take exams and verify your educational credentials, then you're assigned a certain number with that state, and all of your drawings and documents after that are going to be stamped with your what they call a seal, your architect's seal, and then you'll sign that. But this is important because the AIA is really concerned about issues of professional representation and a standard of care as a profession, and the TBAE is concerned about issues of legal standards of care and how architects represent the entire profession and what rules are placed on architects in the practice of architecture. So the TBAE has, legal documents that regulate the profession, and if you are unsure as a practicing architect, what you should do in certain situations, there are, prescribed rules that the TBAE sets forth in order to regulate the profession so that everyone's kind of practicing with that same legal standard of care. The other thing that they do is they regulate the licensure and registration of everyone every year so that they can make sure that people are receiving continuing education every year, so that as long as you're a licensed professional, that you're continuing your education into the profession and that stays current year to year. Now, you can become registered in other states, and if you are working on a project in a state other than Texas and you're registered in Texas, then you need to apply to become registered in that other state. So you need to be registered or licensed in the state where the project is being built in order for it to be valid. One of the other responsibilities that architects have, not just to their kind of professional obligations and their legal obligations as practicing professionals, is to protect the public safety. And a lot of times we'll talk about issues of public concern, meaning, how do issues affect the community, or how do issues affect, urban areas or project areas that a building is going to be built in. But the idea of protecting public safety really has to do with making sure that buildings are constructed in a way that keeps people as safe as possible. And a lot of this has to do with adherence to building codes and other standards that are set forth by various regulating organizations. Now, one of the things we look at are the building codes that are put out every few years, and these are the latest building codes that regulate commercial construction. This is the 2012 and the 2015 International Building Codes, and the building codes have to do with protecting the public safety, meaning the number one reason building codes exist is for life safety. And, it's for no other reason than to make sure that if there is an emergency, that people could get out of a building in time before it collapses, or if there's a fire, that people have enough emergency exits to get out, or the stairways are wide enough so that there's enough room for everybody to exit, or that the stairs are constructed in a way where people won't trip and fall, or that there are materials that are used that prevent the spread of smoke and fire. So the International Building Code, specifically, it's for commercial construction, but there are all kinds of codes that are used in order to protect public welfare and public safety. These are typically modified every few years. The IBC, or the International Building Code, is on a 3-year cycle. There are other codes specifically for residential purposes, and the one that's used in the city of Austin is the international residential code, but it's up to your local jurisdiction, wherever you happen to live. That city council or mayor can adopt whatever building code they decide to adopt and adhere to. So if you are building a project in another city, for example, you're still in the same state, but you're in another city, you would need to check with that local jurisdiction or that city or that county or that town and see what building code they are going to be enforcing wherever that project is built, and then you need to design according to that particular building code. So even though we say this is an international building code, it's not universally adopted, and each version is different. So, it's up to that city to determine which version of the code they're going to use. So if they wanted to use the 2003 building code, they can do that. And if they want to use 2015, they can do that too. So it's up to the architect, and it's the architect's responsibility to find out which code is in effect and to design according to that code, because once it's built, they will send out inspectors from that local jurisdiction to enforce on that particular version of the code. And the IBC, the International Building Code, is modified and written by the International Code Council. And the International Code Council, or the ICC, is just a group of engineers and architects and code officials and inspectors who have a conference every 3 years, and they get together and see if there's anything that should be changed, or maybe there's something that is in the news or affected people that should have some kind of impact on the new version of the code. And then it gets rewritten, and then it gets published every 3 years. Another issue of standards that architects are expected to adhere to, especially in commercial construction, are accessibility standards. And oftentimes we talk about the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, as kind of our go-to accessibility standard. And the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, was enacted in the early 1990s, and there was a small part of that had to do with building accessibility. It's a piece of federal legislation that's overall addresses many issues of public life for persons with disabilities. So just a small portion of that has to do with building accessibility. But we kind of shorten that and we say, okay, well, the ADA has to do with accessibility. And so the standards that we have in effect today look to the Americans with Disabilities Act accessibility guidelines. That's a portion of the ADA that we use, and those apply to issues of access into and out of buildings, throughout buildings, and even at the level of the community, meaning like at the street level, and curb cuts and crosswalks and sidewalks. Are people able to move throughout the community and throughout buildings in public life that will not restrict them based on a disability that someone has? And so as you kind of go around town the next couple of weeks, just kind of start to notice things that are not accessible. When we talk about accessibility, people tend to be surprised, and they'll say, well, I was in a building yesterday that was not accessible. And depending on when it was built, it may or may not be accessible. And, if it has or hasn't been renovated, it may not have undergone that accessibility review or that kind of process. We'll look a lot more at that later on in the semester, and how that has an impact on buildings that are both public use buildings and private or residential buildings. One of the main responsibilities that architects have on architectural projects is working with their clients. And the client could be a single owner For example, if you're working on a residential project, then you might have one or two or three people that are going to occupy that house or that structure, and they're your clients. Or it could be one person, and that's your client. But it could also be that your client is a government agency or a corporation or a board of trustees of a school or a board of directors of a company that's going to be constructing a corporate campus. The definition of client can vary pretty widely. And so whatever it happens to be, your job as the architect is to work closely with the client to not only understand what their needs are, but also try and meet those needs in the best possible way while still performing your other duties and responsibilities, and trying to come up with the best building solution and design solution possible. Another responsibility that architects have is assembling the project team. And by the project team, we mean who is going to be assisting the architect in working on this project. And oftentimes, there's that idea or that mythology of the star-architect. There's like a lone wolf, single person just designing and creating all of these things, when in reality, architecture is a highly collaborative endeavor, and typically, not only at the firm level, we looked at that first picture of that architecture firm. There are tons of architects and people that all work together on various projects. But in addition to the architects, you have all of the people that will assist on the project in various aspects of the building in which they are particularly skilled. So when the architect or architecture firm, I should say, is assembling the project team, they start thinking about their sub-consultants. And their sub-consultants are all of the people who are going to be contracted with the architect, meaning the architect is going to sign a contract with the client to say, I'm going to design your building and produce drawings and models for this amount of money in this amount of time, and they're contractually bound to the client to be able to perform those duties that they've signed up for. And then in addition to that, the architect then signs agreements with all of their engineers, landscape architect, other consultants, interior designer, anyone else who's going to be part of the project team on the design side, assisting the architect. The architect will sign an agreement with them and they will pay them. So they get paid by the client, and then they turn around and disperse funds to all their sub-consultants. So all the sub-consultants could include structural engineer, civil engineer, mechanical engineer, all other kinds of engineers. Depending on what the project is, you're probably going to have a lot of specialized consultants. So let's say you're working on a theater or a concert hall. You're probably going to have an acoustical engineer or an acoustical consultant. Or if you're working on an airport, you might have a transportation engineer. But working with sub-consultants is a huge part of your duties and your obligations as an architect, and it's also a huge help and a great collaborative effort in forming the project team in the best possible way. So obviously designing the building is part of the architect's responsibility, but you can see that this is just one aspect of all of the things that the architect is responsible for. So assembling the project team, and then in the process of designing the building, kind of keeping everyone working toward a common goal, kind of on the same page, communicating with everyone effectively, communicating with the client about the design of the building, communicating with the subconsultants about what portion of the work they'll need to complete, and what the design of the building is looking like, and sharing documentation and models and drawings. And also something that we call coordination. Coordination means taking all of the drawings and models and documents that all of the subconsultants, all the engineers and other designers have put together, and then the architect is responsible for putting them all in one kind of consistent, cohesive package and checking to make sure that there's not conflicting information. So they'll take information, for example, from the structural engineer and the mechanical engineer and put them together and see if there's a beam in the same place as a piece of mechanical equipment or piping or ductwork. And if there is, then the architect's job is to communicate among the subconsultants and try and come up with a common solution. But this is something that makes for a great building. The better the coordination, the better the end result, and the better the final product is going to be. Another responsibility that architects have is an environmental one. When we talk about environmental issues with architecture with regard to building, typically we refer to sustainability. Now, the idea with sustainability is as you're selecting materials and as you're designing systems that are going to be in operation in the building, you have to think to yourself, is this a sustainable system? Meaning, is it going to be efficient over time? Is it going to be respectful of environmental resources? And where did you source the material that's being used for the building? A lot of times when we look at how you measure sustainability, we talk about LEED. And LEED is a national program. It stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. And sometimes you'll hear about this when you look at this little symbol in the upper left corner of the slide. Often if you go into a building that has been LEED certified, you'll see a plaque that looks like this. Sometimes it's gold or bronze or silver, depending on the level of LEED rating it received, because usually it's rated in terms of gold, silver, platinum, all those kinds of things. And so those are the different levels, and the plaque will be that color or that kind of metallic color of the rating that the building received. And this rating system is sponsored by the U.S. Green Building Council, and because it's a national program, it has some standards that you would need to meet in order to receive that credential. Now, even if you're not aiming for a LEED certification, the idea of sustainability is a global one. And we're trying to look at, how the material that's being used is going to be at its most efficient, and sustainability in terms of, can we sustain operating this building over time? So even if a material that was used didn't use a lot of resources necessarily to get it installed, or come from the source, if it's going to make the building less efficient over time, then the architect needs to look at that and look at the operation of it and its initial construction and its initial efficiency. Sometimes when we're looking at LEED certification, architects play an integral role in doing analysis of the building before it's built, so that you can predict how efficient the building is going to be and where all the materials came from, and the architect is responsible for knowing all the manufacturer data, all the sourcing information, and sometimes that can be compiled into data reports and analysis all by the architect. So it's a responsibility that the architect has not just on the design side, but often to the client. That's part of the architect's responsibility to the client. And depending on how important sustainability is to the client or to the owner, that may be part of the architect's agreement with the owner or their contract that they sign, that they're going to address issues of sustainability and that they're going to provide documentation or reporting. They may even address what LEED certification they would like to achieve with this building so that the architect from the beginning is designing with that goal in mind. Another huge responsibility that the architect has is to work with the contractor. Now, typically, the architect and the contractor do not sign a written agreement with each other or a written contract. And that's because typically the architect is going to sign an agreement initially with the owner. So there's an owner-architect agreement in place. And when we say agreement, we're talking about contracts. So these are legal documents that are signed by both parties. So if the architect has a legal agreement with the owner to provide services and to design a building and to provide documentation, then they are working toward that owner or client's interest constantly. Now, on the other side, on the building side, the contractor is basically going to do the same thing. The contractor is going to sign an agreement or a contract with the owner and say, I'm going to build this building in this amount of time for this amount of money and with these parameters, with this, set of materials, and they are working in the client's or owner's best interest to get that done. And so the reason why the architect and contractor don't sign an agreement with each other is because that would actually become in direct conflict with the agreements they already both have in place for the owner. So it benefits the owner so that both the architect and contractor are kind of always constantly working in the best interest of the owner. And yet there is a major kind of piece of this is the ability of the architect and contractor to work together. So even though they might have potentially competing interests with each other, their common interest is working for the owner for the best possible result. And working with the contractor doesn't necessarily just mean working during construction with the contractor. Depending on when the owner signed an agreement with the contractor, they may have brought the contractor in early in the design process or earlier in the design process. And if that's the case, sometimes that's pretty beneficial for the architect. They can get cost estimation information much earlier on. They're not going through the entire design process and modeling everything and drawing everything and then finding out right before they go into construction that it's over budget or too expensive. So often having the contractor in place earlier can be really beneficial to the architect in terms of getting feedback for construction and cost information, and also just logistical information where the contractor might say, okay, I see you've designed this, let's look at some different ways that we could build this, and then that gives feedback to the architect and they can incorporate that into their detailing and into their drawings. We'll talk about this a lot later in some later units where we talk about exactly what drawings and documents the architect typically produces. But it's maybe kind of a myth that the architect is essentially done once their drawings are complete and their design is complete. Construction is a huge part of the architect's responsibility, and going out to the job site and verifying that what's being built is consistent with what the architect drew and designed and modeled is really essential. And so here you see this architect on the right working with a contractor, and this is very common. This is a huge part of the architect's job. And a lot of times you will go out and do specific documentation once you go out to the job site and you take a look around. You'll probably look around a bit and then take photographs, take notes, and then go back to your office and write up a report, and then you'll make a formal report about what it is that you saw. When we talk about what is the architect responsible for, a lot of times we talk about their service to the community and what they can do to benefit others. And because buildings are such a big part of the community's built environment, often architects will provide pro bono services to various parties in the community. Now, architects are not required to provide pro bono services, and pro bono just means free. So you're not charging fees for the work that you do. And so it's like community service, like community architectural services for whoever happens to need them where you live. Again, they're not required to do that, but I think a lot of architects would tell you that the opportunity to do pro bono services offers a different type of project typically than their fee generating projects or their fee generating work, and it offers a chance to connect with the community and also to do some good. So this is just a graph about that the AIA had put together about percentage of people who had done pro bono work. This is from a couple of years ago, and quite a few had done more than 10% of their work was pro bono. Now when we talk about how people get pro bono work, a lot of times the opportunity might just present itself to you. Someone might know that you're an architect and say, I work for this nonprofit and we need somebody to draw up some plans because we're thinking about doing an addition and we're raising funds and we need a rendering. Then it might not be things that they have any money to pay for, or they don't have any resources to provide for architectural fees or architectural services. So it's a good way to donate back to the community. There was an organization called Architecture for Humanity. It's kind of similar to Habitat for Humanity, but instead of building services, people going on building, that people would design. And it's kind of gone through some volatility in the last year. I think it still might potentially operate as an organization, but has shut down temporarily. The people who chaired that organization have resigned, and unfortunately it's disbanded a bit. But there are many other opportunities for architects to be able to provide services in their community. And in a place like Austin, those are all over the place, so you don't have to look very far to be able to find someone who could utilize pro bono services. Professional liability is something that we discuss quite a bit, especially on the front end of a project. When we're going to sign an agreement with whomever, it could be the owner typically, you really want to address what is going to be happening in the project so that you're trying to anticipate all of the ins and outs of the project and sign an agreement so that you know as an architect what it is that you're committing to. And professional liability just means you're responsible or you're liable for all of the things that are contained in your contract with the owner. So you want to make sure that you fulfill all of the obligations of the contract, whatever they may happen to be. And then you have those legal obligations to the owner, but professionally, you also have an obligation to make sure that everything that you sign, all the drawings that you stamp and seal and sign, that you have checked them yourself, that you have checked them for code purposes, you have checked them for structural purposes, and that, to the best of your knowledge, that what is going to be built from the drawings that you checked is going to be, safe for the public. It's going to be secure, and there aren't going to be problems down the road. A lot of times when we talk about issues of liability, you're kind of looking at those after the fact. Like if something had gone wrong or there was some kind of defect on the building, you might look to, was it a defect during construction? Was it a defect on the design side? So this is a very serious and critical issue that architects, need to be responsible for. And I think, as you go through the process of becoming licensed, you become really aware of how much you're responsible for, because you're putting your name on every single drawing and every single sheet that goes out on a project. When we talk about a breach of contract, breach just in general, and we're really referring to breach of agreement or breach of contract. So when we would say an architect is in breach, it means that they did not fulfill all the obligations of the contract or the agreement that they signed. Now that could be on a couple of different sides. We sign agreements with the owners, the owner-architect agreement, as part of, typically the beginnings of our project, but you also sign agreements with your subconsultants. So, the architect could be in breach of their contract with the subconsultants if, say, you hired a structural engineer, for example, to work on a project, and then they provided services and you didn't pay them. Like, let's say they, did everything they were supposed to do. They produced drawings for you. They, did all of that, and then you ultimately did not pay them. So the architect would be in breach of that contract. And so it could be anything that the architect did not do that they were either legally or professionally obligated to do. And, it opens themselves up to legal action. And you can avoid this, hopefully, by just being aware of all of the things that are contained in the agreement. And, we talk sometimes about what the agreement should be. Typically, most people will use AIA standard documents so that they're familiar with what's in those agreements. And we'll talk a bit in the next lecture about what's contained in those. Negligence, and hopefully this situation never happens to you, but negligence on the part of the architect could be where something was designed that was eventually going to fail. Now, there are certain things that cannot be anticipated, things like acts of nature and other things, but if the architect was negligent in their duty to make sure that it was going to be structurally sound and built according to code and things like that, then the architect can be found negligent for that. Now, we're not talking about, defects on the construction side, because obviously if the architect is designing it but not building it, and then there was something built differently from the drawings, either the contractor tried to do something different to save money or something else, and there was an accident, then, or some kind of collapse, then it's not the architect's responsibility. But if that was found to be on the design side, like a design flaw, then the architect can be found negligent for that. And so you just want to make sure that all of the things that are required on the project, usually things that have to do with code violations or anything else that's prescribed on the project that you know that you're responsible for, that you just make sure that you kind of check those things off at the end before they go out for construction or before you sign off on them and seal them. One thing that we tend to talk about in architecture is the idea of intellectual property. And intellectual property is not unique to architecture. It's, an idea that if you have something creative that you make or you design, that you own the rights to that. And that if someone else copies that or takes that, then you could potentially take legal action against them. Intellectual property is pretty interesting in architecture because oftentimes it's difficult to prove or show that someone directly copied that work. And the reason is because a lot of times architecture is referential, meaning you'll refer to something more historic in some portion of the building that you design or that you detail, and many buildings are so similar that oftentimes that is difficult to show that somebody copied exactly what it is that that you had done. And that's not coming from me. That's looking at a lot of the lawsuits over intellectual property in architecture. The majority are not won by the person who's suing for copying their intellectual property. A lot of times they'll either settle it or throw out the suit or side with the person who was being sued. And a lot of times it kind of pays to take more risks in your design because it's a little bit easier to tell that that was your work, in terms of intellectual property. And so it's actually really an ongoing issue in architecture about, can you copyright your designs, and is that something that has truly never been done before, or are the forms that you're making, has someone else done them before and you don't really own them, even though you're designing them or you think that they're not referencing something else. Potentially there might be someone who had done that before.